as well. So we discussing types of trade protection, right? So when we're looking at types of trade protection, the first thing I want to talk about is, or first thing that I want to revise is basically this idea that if you are looking at a case like this one, right? I'm looking from the notes, page 50. If you look at this, guys, this is demand and supply in the domestic market, but and this is domestic price. But if the world price is lower than the domestic price, then in this case, we saw yesterday that we become what we call an importer. Because if the world is offering you a lower price, then you want to import. And you know, at PFW, Q2 is your domestic demand. As we said, this is your domestic demand because domestic individuals will basically be buying Q2 quantity, and Q1 will be what we call our domestic supply. So Q1 will be your domestic supply. Why is Q1 your domestic supply? And हमने ये कहा था, we said this last time, was just that there are some producers who can match this international price. Let's say if this was $15, right? And let's say this becomes, let's say, um, $5. There's some producers who are able to match this $5 price. Who are these producers? And the answer is all these producers here are able to match this price of $5, and therefore 0 to Q1 will be your domestic sort of supply, while Q1 to Q2 will be your level of import. So your level of imports, let me write this, your level of imports in this case, this would be your level of import. So whenever the world price is lower than the domestic price, you become an importer. And domestic consumers, by the way, will basically be very happy. So if I look at why would domestic consumers be happy, if you look at this diagram, guys, let's call this area A. So consumer surplus for domestic producers was probably area A, right? Why? Because consumer surplus is area above the price, below the demand curve. But when you are basically allowing trade to happen, consumer surplus will become A plus even this B region. What is this B region? B region is basically this whole region. So you are basically looking at it from a consumer perspective. Consumers will be very happy because of the lower price, their consumer surplus will go up. So from a perspective of trade benefiting your consumers, it's definitely going to result in consumer surplus to go up. So I'm saying just that when you allow international trade, because the price goes down, your consumer surplus will go up. And the area B is depicting that rise in consumer surplus. This is something which we didn't discuss yesterday, but I'm saying this, that there will be a rise in consumer surplus because of the idea that because your price was previously 15, you allow international trade to happen, and now the world price is 5, which is basically what consumers are going to get. So more consumers are buying. These many more consumers are now buying the good, and also consumers are buying it at a lower price. So consumer surplus will go up. Is there any question? Does that make sense, guys? Do you have any question? Anything that you want to sort of ask me uh, about this diagram? So first thing first, when your price is below, when the international price or world price is below, you become an importer, and when you import, your consumer surplus go up, because when the price fall, consumer surplus will rise by area sort of B, as we can see from the diagram. Does that make sense? Now, I want to move on if everyone is happy with it. If you have a question, please ask. It's to do with the fact that what if your case is such that you're looking at a case of tariffs. So we move on to this discussion. Before I move on to that discussion, yeah. So we now going to move on to discussion of tariffs. So let's read the notes and let's see what have we written, and we can then recap on the diagram as well. So when you look at this, a tariff is a tax that is charged on imported goods. So for us, tariff is basically a tax, right? In the case of a tariff, it will shift the world supply curve upward. So just like any tax, it results in supply to shift upward. Okay. Since it is placed on the foreign producers of the good and not on the domestic producers, we are putting it on the world supply curve. You don't put it on the domestic supply, you're putting it on the world supply because you're putting a tariff on the international producers. And like any tax, a tariff shifts the supply curve upward by the amount of the tax. So we'll see it will make the supply curve shift upward by the amount of the tax. And I showed it yesterday. I'm going to show it one more time in 1 minute because I just wanted to sort of first recap of what the stuff that we're saying here. So it's going to shift the supply curve upward by the amount of the tax. In the case of a tariff, it will shift the world supply curve upward since it is placed on the foreign producers and not on the domestic producers. So let's look at this diagram, guys. This is the diagram, which is what we did yesterday. It's slightly different because there are these areas 1, 2, 3, 4, which I want to sort of also talk about. So let's assume there was no tariff. If there was no tariff, so if I write before tariff, okay, if I write before tariff, just 1 minute, guys. If I write before tariff, your quantity that was basically bought was Q2. Q2 was your domestic demand, and Q1 was your domestic supply. Does that make sense, guys? So my dog is barking, so I want to settle the dog in 1 minute. You guys have to give me 1 minute, okay? Sorry for the disturbance. So guys, what we were talking about is this idea that when you are looking at putting a tariff, before tariff, the quantity demanded was Q2, quantity supplied was Q1. So this is domestic demand versus this is your domestic supply. And that's why your level of imports was Q2 minus Q1. So Q2 minus Q1 became our level of imports. If the government is unhappy with the level of imports, so this is the level of imports, Q2 minus Q1. This bit is your level of imports before tariff. Now if the government is unhappy with this level of tariff, they say that, you know what, let's make the world price to go up in the domestic market. Let's put a tariff on the importer, because when we put a tariff on the importer, the good will become expensive. So now the new price will be PW plus T. So you put a tariff of T. So this gap between the two supply curves, this gap is equal to T. This is your tariff, okay? So when you put a tariff, the price goes up. When the price goes up, automatically what you can see, guys, is that at PW plus T now, the domestic demand will be Q3, while domestic supply will be Q4. So after tariff, your Q3 will be your domestic demand, Q4 will be your domestic supply, and therefore Q3 minus Q4 will be your level of imports. Do you guys get that? This is your level of imports after. So this Q3 minus Q4 will be level of imports. But there's something else that has happened which is important to understand. And that's why today's discussion, when I started off, I said, look at the consumer surplus before versus after. So if I ask you, what's your consumer surplus before tariff? Consumer surplus before tariff basically was all this area under the triangle above PW price. So when you were looking at putting a tariff, before tariff, XBPW is your consumer surplus. So XBPW is the area under the demand curve above the market price PW. So all this area was your consumer surplus. जो मैंने अभी पहले बताया था, what I explained to you guys earlier, all this was consumer surplus. And why do we have this consumer surplus happening? We have this consumer surplus happening because the price has gone down from पहले PD थी, the price has gone down to PW. So consumer surplus will be all this area under the demand curve above the market price PW. What's the consumer surplus after? If I ask us, what's the consumer surplus after? And the answer to this is the consumer surplus after is going to be now lesser because now you've increased the price to PW plus T. The consumer surplus now be X D F. Why? Because now what you've done is that you have reduced or you increased your price. Because you have increased your price, the consumer surplus has gone down uh, from XB PW to XD plus T. So or XD यहाँ पे है F. If I zoom this, it's going to be from XBPW to it's gone to XD F, which means this area, that is the colored area, will be what we call a loss of consumer surplus. So if I look at after tariff, if I look at loss of consumer surplus, let me keep on happening. So there's a loss of consumer surplus. The loss of consumer surplus will be equal to, if we could zoom it here, you guys see that it's going to be F D B J. Okay, F D F um, F D B, and there's a J here, so I'm going to use that J. So FDBJ is my loss of consumer surplus, which is also, I can say this loss of consumer surplus is equal to this area 1 plus area 2 plus area 3 plus area 4. So area 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 is my loss of consumer surplus. And why is this loss of consumer surplus happening? Can somebody answer me on the chat? Why is this loss of consumer surplus happening? Anyone who can tell me why this is happening? Is there any question about um, um, anything that we've done so far? So we are saying when you put a tariff, you lose consumer surplus equal to area 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, which is basically because the price has gone up. Now I want to talk about what these area 1, 2, 3, and 4 are. But I need to ask you guys if you are, if everyone is sorted in terms of why there is a loss. Let's talk about now what these areas are. So the first thing I want to talk about is this, that if you look at area 1, basically what happened was this, that when you were importing without tariff, the total domestic supply was Q1. Before imports before you were putting a tax on imports, your total sort of domestic, if you can look at this, domestic supply was Q1. But when you put a tariff, your domestic supply went to Q4. Isn't that true? Which means domestic supply is actually going up after tariff. And the reason why domestic supply is going up is because these many producers, Q1 minus Q4, are those producers who are now becoming more competitive after tariff. So what is happening is that after tariff, I can write this, after tariff, Q4 minus Q1 producers are becoming what we call more competitive because the price has gone up. And because they're becoming more competitive, they are selling more. How much more? Q4 minus Q1 is the quantity that they're selling more. So what is area 1? We say area 1 is basically a rise in, let me write this here. Area 1 is simply a rise in domestic producer surplus. It's the rise in domestic producer surplus. And the reason why the producer surplus is going up was because when Q1 was sold before tariff, this was the producer surplus. This was the producer surplus of the domestic producers. Now, when you are, because PW was the price and only these guys were selling the good. But when you put a tariff, your price went up to PW plus T, which means these these producers are now gaining extra producer surplus in terms of this area one. So what is area one? It's a rise in domestic producers because more domestic producers are able to sell the good. So from consumer, this area one went to producers. So this area one was previously with consumer because this was part of the consumer surplus. Now it's gone to producers because producers have benefit in terms of extra price. Okay, so first thing first, area one was belonging to consumers and now it's going to producers. What about area three? Okay, I'm going to talk about area 2 and 4 later, but what about area 3? Area 3, if you look at it, guys, area 3 is a rectangle. Yeah, one side of the rectangle is T, because PW plus T minus PW, this distance is the amount of tariff you're putting, right? I wrote T here. Another side of it, this is the amount of imports. So area 3, if I look at the formula for area 3, we say area 3 is simply T times Q3 minus Q4. In other words, we call this as tax or tariff. I should write tariff revenue. It's the revenue you get from um, importing the good. When you put a tariff on this importer, let's say if you put a $5 tariff on importer, and let's say he was getting importing 40 units, so the tariff revenue will be $5 times 40 the imported goods will be 5 fours are $200. Make sense? So area 3, in other words, was your consumer surplus, but now it has become what we call tariff revenue. And who gets this tariff revenue? If I could ask you guys, who is pocketing this tariff revenue? Can anyone tell me that? Can anyone tell me who will be pocketing this? Government. Awesome. And Zainab, your question, I'm sorry, I saw it right now. These are domestic producers. Yes, Zainab, these are domestic producers who are basically pocketing this surplus. So area 3 went to the government. Area 1 went to the domestic producers. Remember, when you put a tariff, who are the parties that benefit? Number one party that benefit is domestic producers because they will be able to sell more. They are becoming more competitive and they will benefit by area 1. Number two party that benefit is the government because they will get more taxes. So these higher tax revenue is going to be pocketed by the government. But what is area 2 and area 4? We say area 2 and area 4. Let me write this. We say area 2 and area 4. We call them dead weight loss. We call them deadweight losses or deadweight or social welfare loss. Why do we call it deadweight loss? Because these are the benefits that are lost, but they're not going to any party whatsoever. Why are they not going to any party whatsoever? So let me go back to area 2 and area 4 in the diagram and look at it very closely as to why they are called deadweight losses. But before I do that, if you have any question, please ask me. I think somebody asked the question. Yes. So, you guys have any question before I move on? No? Are we good to move on? Okay. So, guys, why is this a deadweight loss? So let's just look at it very closely. If I look at it very closely, area 2 basically, when you made these inefficient producers to produce more, remember, why am I calling them inefficient to start off with? I'm calling them inefficient because they should not have been selling to start off with. And the reason why they should not be selling to start off with is because there is a very efficient international producer out there, But now that when you are making these inefficient producers to sell more, you are making inefficiency to be promoted. So we say area 2 is basically inefficiency as, or sort of welfare loss. We say welfare loss as inefficient producers are producing more, or inefficient domestic producers are producing more. So we say because inefficient domestic producers are producing more, we are going to have this area 2 as a welfare loss. Okay, Mohammed Ali, I'm going to come back to your question in 1 minute. So I'm saying this, that area 2 is that welfare loss. But why is this welfare loss happening? Because you had these Q4 minus Q1 producers who should not have been producing to start off with, now producing, and because of that you're losing out area 2, which is basically inefficient producers are producing more. Similarly, what is going to also happen after tariff is, because when you put a tariff, you have Q2 minus Q3 consumers denied of the good. After tariff, you have these consumers who were previously getting the good, because when the price was Q2, there were PW consumers who were getting the good, and they were getting the good at a low price. Now these consumers, or this part of my demand curve, is going to be not met. Why is it not met? Because these are those consumers who were previously buying. Now these Q2 minus Q3 consumers are denied of the good, and because they are denied of the good, the end impact of this will be that these guys will be losing out on consumer surplus. So we say this, that area 4 is the deadweight loss that happened as Q2 minus Q3. Let me open the diagram and show you guys this. Q2 minus Q3 are these. Q2 minus Q3 domestic consumers are denied of the good. Okay, so while these consumers are denied of the good, Q2 minus Q3 consumers, these extra producers are producing who are inefficient to start off with. End result will be you are looking at area 2 and 4, which is the deadweight loss that is happening. Now I'm going to answer the question. So Sidra is asking me, why are they inefficient? Sidra, they are inefficient because if somebody can make the good internationally, somebody was making it for PW. By putting a tariff, you promoted these guys to now be able to sell. इससे पहले they were not able to sell, right? They were not able to sell before because they couldn't match the price of PW. But when you made the price to go up to PW plus T, you made these inefficient Q4 minus Q1 producers to sell more. And this Q4 minus Q1 producers are pocketing also this area 1 as a rise in producer surplus. Because what's the producer surplus? Area under the price above the supply curve. Now, this area 1 is the change in producer surplus, which is happening because Q4 minus Q1 producers are producing more. Similarly, area 2 is, so area 2 is the loss that happens because you are asking more inefficient producers to produce more, which are domestic to start off with. Number 2 is this, that second thing is that this area 4 is also a loss of consumer loss of deadweight loss, because it's an area that is not going to anyone, and it is happening because some consumers are denied of the good who were efficient to start off with. Are we happy with this point? Does that make sense? So this is the discussion on tariff. So if I give you a quick summary of tariff, a tariff results in consumers to lose out, their consumer surplus will fall. Who will gain? Domestic producers who were inefficient, but now because of the fact that you put the price to go up, they can sell more. Who also benefit will be government in terms of tariffs. So government likes sometimes putting tariffs because this gives them tax revenue, which is good for the economy's operations. Okay, who loses out? Consumers, of course, international producers, of course, and there will be a loss of efficiency, of course, because you are making more inefficient producers to produce more, and that's why tariffs result in deadweight losses or inefficiency to start off with. Okay, so that's the quick summary of tariff. If we are happy with tariff, I'm going to now move on to another discussion, um, which is called your quotas. Okay, I'm going to move on to quota in 1 minute. The next discussion that I want to have is basically to do with quotas. Okay, what are quotas, by the way? Quotas are an alternative policy. Let me read this first, and then I'm going to sort of draw the diagram for quota, and then we can discuss it. But a quota is an alternative policy that a country may adopt, and that is like a limit to the imports of a commodity to a given volume. So basically, a quota is what we call a definition of a quota is what we call a quota is a so quota is a physical limit on the imports. Okay, so while a tariff is increasing the price, a quota is decreasing supply. And when you decrease supply, what happens? The price goes up. So what automatically going to happen, you will soon see, is that you will basically make the supply to go down. And of course, when you make the supply to go down, the result will be the price will go up. And when the price will go up, you will soon see consumer surplus will fall. So quota is kind of like tariff, but while tariff is making the price go up, directly quota is making the supply of imports to fall, and that in turn basically make the price go up and therefore consumer surplus to fall. So remember this, that let's sort see a diagram and then and see this how quota works. But basically quota is a physical limit on the goods that are sort of imported in a country. So let's draw the diagram together of quota, and then we can sort of review it. But let's say currently this is our demand and supply. Okay, so this is our demand and supply domestic, and let's say you decide you had a world price here, PW. So this is your world supply, quantity and prices here, and let's say you are right now importing Q2 minus Q1. Okay, so right now you're importing Q2 minus Q1, and let's say Q2 is like 300 and Q1 is like 100, and right now your level of imports for quota is 300 minus 100, yani it's going to be 200. Okay, are you all with me? So the government said, you know what, this is too much. This 200 quantity is too much. We want to restrict this quantity. We want to make it lower. We want to make sure that the quantity of imports go from, let's say, 200 to 150. Okay, so they're restricting the overall supply to 150. In other words, they are saying, this is an important thing to understand, they're saying we allow this supply, so this supply is supply domestic. Okay, plus, okay, this is, remember this guys, they're saying now the quota is going to be let's say 100, the quota will be 100. Okay, only 100, let's say, cars are allowed to be imported. Agar koi quota nahi hoga, if there is no quota, then 300 minus 100 is 200 is the total quantity that is being allowed. But now you're saying the quantities that are allowed are not 200, but they are 100, which means if 200 was allowed, then the total supply was at point A. Okay, because A means no restriction on import, and you had a total imports will be 200. So 100 plus 200 mil will give you 300. But now you say only 100 of quota is allowed, which means I'm going to be like S domestic plus 100 will be allowed, which means S domestic plus this is allowed. So this is as domestic plus quota is allowed. Do you guys get that? So आपने किया क्या? What you did was that you like, okay, if there was, if I put a, by the way, if I put a quota of 0, then this becomes my domestic supply. If I put a quota of 100, then my domestic supply plus quota, which means this will be the total supply. If I put a quota of, for example, 200, then my supply will go here. Do you guys get that? So what I'm trying to say is that government said this, that is supply ko nahi hone dena. I'm going to make my new supply curve to be basically as domestic plus quota, which means this horizontal distance is basically the quota. So government said this much quota is allowed in the market, which means, guys, look at this, guys. If this much is the quota allowed, what will be the new price in the domestic market? And the answer will be the new price in the domestic market will not be at point A, but at point B, and it will be equal to P dash. So the price has gone up because you have actually reduced the quantity. And if I ask you guys, what is the new domestic demand? Your answer will be, your new domestic demand will be this much. Q4. What's your new domestic supply? Well, at P dash, new domestic supply will be Q3. Okay, let's call this point C. What's your level of quota? And the answer will be this distance between these two will be your level of quota. So your quota now will be Q4 minus Q3. So guys, it's a little different from how we've done things before. But if I want to recap this. So agar aapke paas, if there was no restriction on trade, you would have been buying Q3, of which 100 was coming from domestic market and 300 minus 100 was the level of imports. So level of imports was like 200, which is Q2 minus Q1. So let me write this here. Level of imports was Q2 minus Q1. The government said this is too many cars. Let's restrict this car from 200 to 200. Okay. So they said domestic producers plus 100 more are allowed. Okay. So this supply curve will shift to the right by 100 because you are allowing only this to happen. And as a result of this, the new price will be with this demand meets this supply curve. And what is this green supply curve? This green supply curve is as domestic plus quota. So you added domestic supply plus quota of 100. So this quota is 100 more cars allowed. When you allow 100 more cars, of course, you are not allowing 200 cars. You are basically restricting supply by by this distance. So Q2 minus Q4 is basically those consumers who are now denied of the good. Because the price has gone up to P dash, I can say this is area 1, 2, 3, and 4. So now my area 1 is going to be area 1 is going to be this much. Area 2 is going to be this much. Area 4 is this much, and area 3 is this region here. So I still have area 1, 2, 3, 4, and the reason why they're happening is because before quota, let me write this. So before quota, my price was PW, my consumer surplus, let's call this XA PW. The consumer surplus was XAPW. Why? Because XAPW is the area under the demand curve above the price. But your after quota, your price became P dash, and therefore consumer surplus fell by area 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. So area 1, 2, 3, 4 is now again the loss of consumer surplus. Why? Because pehle, if Q1 was your domestic supply, now Q3 is your domestic supply. Domestic supply has gone to Q3. So your domestic supply, domestic, let me choose another color. Domestic supply is now Q3. Domestic demand is now Q4, which means Q4 minus Q3 is your quota, which we said is equal to 100. Now, because of this, guys, because of this happening, you still have area 1, 2, 3, 4. What are these area 1, 2, 3, 4 is what I want to discuss. But before I discuss that, is there any question that you guys want to ask me about this? Anything that you want to know? What is area 1? We say area 1 is the same as before, which was basically loss of consumer surplus, gain in producer surplus. So area 1 is, we say area 1 is the gain in domestic producer surplus. And the reason why we call it area 1 as a gain in domestic producer surplus is primarily because now more domestic producers are producing because of the restriction on supply. When you put a restriction on supply, area 1 is the gain in domestic producer surplus who are gaining because now the price is better than before. When you restrict trade, when you restrict quantities, price went up. Similarly, area 3 now, if I look at area 3 is a bit tricky because area 3 now is actually going to be equal to P dash minus PW times your quota. So for example, those importers who are now importing car are now going to get a better price. So we say this, that if previously PW was the price, now P dash is the price, which means some importers who are lucky to get the quota will actually be now getting a better price than they are getting from the world because the Pakistani government has put a quota on the car, and therefore, let's say Toyota Corollas from outside are now going to be expensive. So this area 3 is the extra or higher revenue to importer. And why is this importer getting this benefit? Because now he is getting to sell the car for a higher price. So those lucky importers who are now getting this quota will get P dash minus PW extra revenue because of the fact that the world price is PW. उन्होंने गाड़ी PW में import की होगी लेकिन पाकिस्तान में बेच रहे होंगे P dash minus PW more पे. So there is a higher revenue that you get because of the fact that your car is going to be sold at a higher revenue. Area 2, guys, area 2 and area 4, we are going to have the same things. Area 2 and area 4 are deadweight losses, and area 2 and area 4 are those deadweight losses जो हमने पहले भी कहा था. We saw previously as well. We say area 2 and area 4 are those deadweight losses that are happening because area 2 is the loss of welfare that is happening because more inefficient domestic producers are producing, and area 4 is the deadweight loss which is happening because Q2 minus Q4 domestic consumers are denied of the good. So while Q2 minus Q4 domestic consumers are denied of the goods, so that's why area 4 is happening in terms of a deadweight loss, and area 2 is happening because some inefficient producers like Q3 minus Q1 inefficient producers are now producing more when they should not have been producing. So if I zoom on this diagram, guys, when you put a quota, because you are now restricting supply, the price went up, and we had this area 1, 2, 3, 4 as a loss of consumer surplus. where area 1 is the same as before, area 2 and area 4 are the same as before. It's just area 3 which is different. In tariff, area 3 was going to your government in terms of tariff revenue. In a quota, this area 3 is going to basically your area 3 is going to your importer, who's now getting to import the car at a higher price. Then up area 2, I said, is the loss of efficiency, because Q3 minus Q1, inefficient producers are producing more. It's these inefficient producers who are producing more, and that results in inefficiency to start off with. And Q2 minus Q4 are those domestic consumers who are denied of the good. So that's the loss of welfare, because some consumers are denied of the good. By the way, because area 2 and area 4 are not going to any party, we call it social welfare loss. We didn't call 1 and 3 as social welfare loss, because 1 went to the domestic producer, 3 went to the, in this case, importer. But area 2 and 4 did not go to anyone, and because of that, we call them deadweight losses. So a tariff restricts supply, and by restricting supply, make the good expensive, and therefore results in your social welfare loss to happen. Is there any question about this? I'm good to take questions. So if you look at, by the way, from the notes perspective, we did page 53 and page 54. I have the same diagram here that you can sort of look at, and then we looked at it. So that's the discussion of quota that I wanted to do for today's class. If you guys have any questions, quickly ask me. We still have some time before we wrap up.